anyhow, I think, I think it's something to be aware of. Speaking of things to be aware of, and sort of in the same category, AWS have announced some quiet changes to their marketplace rules. Nothing that I think has an impact from a technology stack perspective per se, but it's certainly going to potentially make life more complicated if you're a CIO, in terms of how they're approaching their marketplace. I forget what they call it, but their commitments that
Yes.
you're making if you're an AWS customer.
Right. So traditionally, AWS has allowed any app sold on its marketplace to be considered part of your AWS spend. Obviously, if you're an AWS shop, AWS is probably your biggest expense in IT. So you obviously want to get to those higher discount tiers and get as much spend there. Now, Amazon is going to require that any app that you get those discount tiers on has to be 100% hosted on AWS instead of just using some AWS services. And that totally makes sense from Amazon's perspective. Why would you want to give discounts on SaaS that is not on the AWS platform? You're not taking advantage of that compute. And that totally makes sense. But it does mean that you are probably going to have to watch out for some of the apps that you're using. And if you are considering those discounts to be a sure thing to come through for the rest of the year, the vendor needs to commit to AWS, or they need to perhaps help you out a little bit from a contractual or discounting perspective. This is definitely something for your IT sourcing people to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I do think one of the things that it points to, and we've talked about this in the abstract or in the big picture for a while, this idea of the major platform players, and I think this is a good reminder. And mind you, I'm a fan of AWS. I think they do fantastic work. I think they're very much tuned into the needs of the enterprise and all of that. And I don't begrudge them this, right? I agree with you on that level. The flip side of it, though, is it's a very stark reminder, and again, this goes for all the major platform players, that their focus is on your spend in their platform within their
Mhm.
ecosystem. And I think that you see the same thing. We talked last week about ServiceNow's approach with the agentic AI and how that was going to be very central or centric around their ecosystem. Same thing with Salesforce's. We're going to talk a minute about SAP. And all of these players, when you're dealing with this major platform, their primary objective with everything they're doing is to pull you into that orbit, and everything is around that. And so I think as a CIO, you need to be very, very concerned and aware of that. And this is an example where it's like, on the one hand, if I'm wearing an AWS hat, it would make total sense. If I'm wearing the CIO hat, it complicates things dramatically, because the things that I'm most interested in, if I'm a CIO, is how do I have multi-vendor support? How do I ensure that I can move workloads
Mhm.
dynamically between providers? And so some of the gray area with this announcement is, well, what happens if I have an application that can run entirely on AWS compute in the AWS ecosystem, but also has the ability to migrate a workload into another environment? And there are apps that are doing that, as a way of providing security or a surety around that, to have resiliency. As a CIO, it makes perfect sense. Well, is that going to violate it, even if my workloads are, in this case, running all in AWS? So I think it's going to certainly complicate it, and like I said, it just is a very stark reminder that these platforms, while on one hand it makes sense to simplify, to put all of your eggs in one basket, you're sort of you're buying into that.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to me because the three major clouds, AWS, Microsoft, and Google, have had different types of policies for SaaS. They all have marketplaces, of course. Google has basically always required that you have everything on Google to get everything discounted. AWS and Microsoft were more flexible. And now, surprisingly, right now, Microsoft is the most flexible of these three clouds in terms of allowing SaaS applications that don't necessarily have everything on Azure still be part of your discounted spend. And I just find that odd that Microsoft would be the most flexible of the three in anything, at least for now. Although that's actually been a trait of Microsoft Azure. The cloud team has been fairly flexible, but I just find it ironic after so many years of dealing with Microsoft audits and Microsoft contracts that this is the case right now.
It is an interesting world we're living in, and does speak again. I think, I mentioned I'm a fan of AWS, so I'm also obviously a fan of Microsoft and their ability to pivot and how they've really turned things around. And this is part of it. I think they've done a really good job of that.